Okay, Pip. Are you ready? Welcome back, Biology 182 lab students. We'll be discussing Lab 40B, as in boy, on page 447 in your lab manual. Phylum Chordata. Taking a look at the first slide, we see many faces we recognize. Tiger, panda, loon, dolphin, chameleon, polar bear, hummingbird, parrotfish, zebra, elephant, great white shark, Jane Goodall and her chimpanzee. But there are some maybe you're not familiar with. Organisms with tentacles coming out of their what appears to be a head. Organisms that are long with large, round mouths with many teeth. An organism that looks like a sponge, and a little organism that's in the substrate of shells that looks like a lance. We'll be taking a look at those organisms in detail. Your objectives for your test are: number one, what are the characteristic traits of chordates? Which of these are derived? In other words, what makes a chordate, and which of those traits are derived? Number two, what are the traits that distinguish the three subphyla in Phylum Chordata and the 6 classes of vertebrates? Each subphyla has their own traits that make them unique, and each class in the subphylum Vertebrata have traits that make them unique. 3, how are chordates adapted to obtain energy and defend themselves? Number 4, what traits lead to increased intelligence? This is a major question in the animal kingdom. How is it that humans and chimpanzees have intelligence? What traits contribute to that? Number 5, what ancestral traits do chordates share with echinoderms and hemichordates, which you studied in the previous lab? I'm going to go ahead and read this slide and then give you some notes in between and some notes at the end. The last phylum of Deuterostome animals to evolve are the chordates, which likely first arose in the early Cambrian, 520 million years ago. However, the fossil record is poor. This is because those animals were soft-bodied and didn't leave anything behind to fossilize well. They are either vertebrates or one of several closely related invertebrates. They are united by having, at least in the embryo phase, a notochord, a hollow dorsal nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a postanal tail. And yes, even you, in development, had a notochord, a hollow dorsal nerve cord, which we still possess. We did at one time have pharyngeal slits and a postanal tail. The phylum consists of 3 subphyla: Urochordata, also known as the tunicates or sea squirts; Cephalochordata, which means head cord, those are the lancelets; and Vertebrata. Tunicate larvae have both a notochord and a nerve cord, which are last in adulthood. They go through a metamorphosis. Adult lancelets have a notochord and nerve cord, but no brain or special sensory organs. Vertebrates are the only subphylum whose members have skulls, and all but hagfish, class Agnatha, develop a spinal column, which protects the dorsal nerve cord. Chordates have evolved from a diverse set of feeding methods ranging from filter feeding to predation. The development of increased cephalization, skulls, larger brains, and social behavior contributed to the evolution of increased intelligence in many vertebrates. Intelligence, as it seems, throughout evolutionary history, has arose multiple times. I'm certain there were many dinosaurs that had some intelligence before 65 million years ago. Phylogeny. The current consensus is that chordates are monophyletic, meaning that Chordata contains all and only the descendants of a single common ancestor, which itself is a chordate. Vertebrates consensus states that vertebrates' nearest relatives are the Cephalochordates. Due to the poor fossil record of earliest chordates, only molecular phylogenetics, or genetic analysis, offers a reasonable prospect of dating the emergence of this phylum. However, the most primitive group, the tunicates, are dated by a confirmed fossil to have arose at least by the early Cambrian, 520 to 525 million years ago. The last major lineage of animals we'll be discussing, obviously, are the chordates. But we need to put the chordates in perspective with the phylogenetic tree to understand where the traits derive to make a chordate. The ancestral traits that chordates possess are 1, true tissues, groups of cells that perform very similar functions. Number 2, bilateral symmetry, which means we can slice a chordate into roughly equal left and right halves. 3, organ systems, so tissues, when you have groups of tissues together we make organs. And then we have organ systems that accomplish a similar goal or task for the organism. 4, they're coelomates. They have a true coelom. 5, they're triploblastic, so in development they have 3 distinct layers of cells. And 6, a complete digestive tract. A mouth to an anus, a tube within a tube. Ancestral traits shared with hemichordates are dorsal nerve cord and pharyngeal slits. Hemichordates are not shown in this phylogeny, but evidence suggests that they are more closely related to echinoderms than chordates. Nonetheless, the chordates share a dorsal nerve cord and pharyngeal slits with hemichordates. Let's take a look at our phylogenetic tree here. Let's start from the beginning, work our way up so we understand where we are. So at the bottom we can see an ancestral colonial choanoflagellate, which gave rise to 2 groups, the parazoans, so no true tissues, those would be the sponges, or sponge-like creatures, and eumetazoa that have true tissues. And the eumetazoan gave rise to 2 groups, the radiata and bilateria. Radiata are obviously radial symmetry, and they're diploblastic. They have 2 cell layers in development. And bilateria has 3 cell layers and is triploblastic. Bilateria gave rise to acoelomates that have no body cavity, such as flatworms, the platyhelminths, and the organisms that had true body cavities. And there are 2 groups of those. Now, the pseudocoelomates, body cavity not enclosed by a mesoderm, those are the rotifers and nematodes. And then the coelomates that have a body cavity enclosed by a mesoderm. And if you notice the dashed line there, that means we're not sure where that phyla fits into the phylogenetic tree. We're guessing somewhere there, but we're not entirely sure. The fossil evidence is spotty. And then out of the coelomates, we have the protostomes, the leucophorates, and deuterostomes. With the leucophorates, we're not sure again where they fit into the coelomate evolution, but we're sure the protostomes, the mollusks, annelids, crabs, and insects, are different than the deuterostomes. That's a coelom derived from a digestive tube. So it's all about that coelom derivation, cell masses versus digestive tube. We have echinoderms and chordates are deuterostomes, but what differentiates echinoderms and chordates? Taking a look at Deuterostome phylogeny, we can see some pictures of some organisms on our phylogenetic tree. Some we're familiar with and some are not. We can see a sand dollar that represents echinoderms, the acorn worm or color worms that represents the hemichordates. But now we get into the Phylum Chordata. We see these strange blue organisms that don't look anything like a vertebrate. Those are the tunicates, or Urochordates. We see some fish-like creatures that are in the shell substrate called lancelets, and those are the Cephalochordates. And then the familiar one, the zebra, that represents the vertebrates. The 2 great Deuterostome lineages lead to the phyla Echinodermata and Chordata. Many studies suggest that, in contrast to the evolutionary relationship shown here, echinoderms and hemichordates are the sister group to the chordates. So remember, although this is the most accepted phylogenetic tree, there are still many studies that show evidence that may point the other direction. Chordates can further be subdivided into Urochordates, which are the tunicates, Cephalochordates, and vertebrates. Since human beings have often wondered about their own origins, it is not surprising that there have been many studies aimed at understanding the evolutionary history of chordates, i.e. the origin of chordates, and the diversification of vertebrates. The main characters that were present in the common ancestor to all chordates were the notochord and the dorsal hollow nerve cord. However, the evolutionary origins of these structures have been controversial, mainly because of difficulties in determining shared ancestral traits between chordate-specific characters and structures in non-chordate deuterostomes, hemichordates, and echinoderms, as well as between vertebrate-specific traits and those of invertebrate chordates. Lancelets and tunicates are not ancestors of vertebrates. Chordates do not evolve from lancelets or tunicates, but rather these groups share a recent common ancestor. In other words, each group is a result of organisms that evolved along a separate lineage, a branch of the phylogenetic tree. Remember that for humans as well. Many people suggest that humans evolved from monkeys. No, that is not true. We evolved from a monkey-like ancestor. Wording is very important there. Characteristic chordate traits we see in the embryonic phase of development are, number one, a dorsal hollow nerve cord. The placement of this nerve cord is what makes it unique. It's on the dorsal side. There are many insects and other invertebrates that have a ventral nerve cord. And in vertebrates, this is what becomes the brain and spinal cord. Number two, a notochord. And that is a flexible cartilaginous rod that offers support. Many muscle attachments are on the notochord and used to contract with. And in vertebrates, this becomes the backbone. Number three, pharyngeal gill slits. Those are openings along the throat region in Urochordates, which are the tunicates, Cephalochordates, which are the lancelets, and Agnatha, which are the lampreys and hagfish. That's for filter feeding. They draw in water and filter it. In classes Chondrichthyes, which is a vertebrate and are also known as sharks, rays, skates, and Osteichthyes, which are the bony fish, is for gas exchange, as you know them as gills. And in all other classes, we see them lost in the adult. However, in humans and many other vertebrates, although lost, those tissues did develop into an organ, and in human beings, it is the auditory canal that connects our throat to our middle ear and is used for balancing our middle ear air pressure with the atmospheric air pressure as it changes over the course of a day. And you'll notice this when you go up and down in elevation. Number four, a post-anal tail. It's often present only in the embryonic stage, and yes, you too had a post-anal tail in development. Remember, adults retain some, all, or none of these traits depending on the class. Now let's go over the phylum of Chordata and the Subphyla. In the invertebrate subphyla, we have Urochordates. Those are the sea squirts and the tunicates. And the Cephalochordates are lancelets. Remember, they have a notochord either in development or into adulthood, but they do not have a backbone. Now, the vertebrates are the subphylum of chordates that have a backbone. But the word backbone is deceiving. For in Agnatha and Chondrichthyes, this backbone is actually cartilage, but is developed much like a bony structure, but made out of different material. Osteichthyes are the bony fish, and they do have true bone. Amphibia, which are our frogs, toads, and salamanders. And we're forgetting the caecilians, No, not a person from Sicily. Class Reptilia, which are the turtle, snakes, and lizards, and of course our crocodilians. The aves, which are the birds, and the mammals. The subphylum Urochordata has roughly 3,000 species. A tunicate is a carbohydrate-rich covering around the body, hence tunicates. They're a subphylum of sac-like filter feeders with an incurrent and excurrent siphon. They are now considered the closest relatives to vertebrates, having dethroned the lancelets from that position. As with other chordates, tunicates possess a notochord during their early stages of development. The motile larval stages have the appearance of a tadpole, whereas the adult stage has a bear-like sessile or sedentary form. They feed by filtering seawater through the pharynx with their gill slits. Most tunicates are hermaphroditic. The eggs are kept inside their body until they hatch, while sperm is released into the water where it fertilizes other individuals when brought in with incoming water. Tunicates are suspension feeders. They have two openings in their body cavity, an incurrent and excurrent siphon. The incurrent siphon is used to intake food and water, and the excurrent siphon expels waste and water. The tunicate's primary food source is plankton. The tunicate's pharynx is covered by miniature hairs called ciliated cells, which allow their consumed plankton to pass down through the esophagus. Their guts are U-shaped, and their anuses empty directly to the outside environment. Tunicates are also the only animals able to create cellulose, which is a carbohydrate, seen in plants. The larval stage ends when the tunicate finds a suitable rock to cement itself in place. The larval form is not capable of feeding and is only a dispersal mechanism. Many physical changes occur to the tunicate's body, one of the most interesting being previously used to control movement. From this comes the saying, the sea squirt eats its own brain. Once grown, adults develop a thick covering, called a tunic, to protect their barrel-shaped bodies from enemies, parasites, and pathogens. Sea squirts are more closely related to fish, birds, and people than worms, sea stars, or other invertebrates. A note on invasive species: over the past few years, Urochordates, notably of the genre Didymnum and Styla, have been invading coastal waters in many countries and are spreading quickly. These mat-like organisms can smother other sea life, have very few natural predators, and are causing much concern. Transportation of invasive tunicates is usually in the ballast water or on the hulls of ships. Current research indicates that many tunicates, previously thought to be indigenous to Europe and the Americas, are in fact invaders. Some of these invasions have occurred over centuries or even millennia ago. In some areas, tunicates are proving to be a major nuisance in aquaculture operations such as salmon farming. Examining the adult and larval form of Urochordata, the tunicates, we can see there are some similarities and differences, which leads us to a question: what's the advantage of a free-swimming larval stage? Well, a free-swimming larval stage allows for dispersal, which is similar to cnidarians, alternating between a sessile and motile stage. But the larvae here, having their notochord, postanal tail, dorsal hollow nerve cord, and pharynx with slits, allows more movement axes than cnidarians, cnidarians going up and down the vertical axis of the water column, whereas these larvae can navigate through all three axes to find a suitable substrate for the adult. We can see that the larvae has a dorsal hollow nerve cord, notochord, postanal tail, and pharynx with slits, which are the four characters that we see in chordates. But the adult only retains the pharynx with numerous slits. We can see that in the larvae, the mouth becomes, in the adult, the incurrent siphon, and the Larva has a stomach that becomes a stomach in the adult, and intestine that becomes the intestine in the adult, and the atrium, and we see that also in the excurrent siphon. And then we have what's called an atriopore, which becomes that excurrent siphon opening. Recent research of gene sequences suggests that tunicates, not lancelets, are the closest living relative to vertebrates. This contrasts with the long-held hypothesis based on the number of chordate traits retained in the adult form, which is greater in lancelets than tunicates. This is a great example of the unreliability of morphology in revealing evolutionary relationships between groups. Feel free to take a look at those videos to help you understand more about the difference between adult and larvae tunicates. Examining the subphylum Cephalochordata are the lancelets, a group of primitive chordates. They're usually found buried in the sand in shallow parts of temperate or tropical seas. In Asia, they are harvested commercially for food that is eaten by both humans and domesticated animals. They are an important object of study in zoology as they provide indications about the origins of vertebrates. Lancelets serve as an intriguing comparison point for tracing how vertebrates have evolved and adapted. Although lancelets split from vertebrates more than 520 million years ago, their genomes hold clues about the evolution, particularly how vertebrates have employed old genes for new functions. They are regarded as similar to the archetypal vertebrate form, but recent genome research suggests that tunicates, again, not lancelets, are the closest living relatives to vertebrates. The physical features. Lancelets grow to about 5 to 8 centimeters at the longest. That's 2 to 4 inches. In common with other vertebrates, lancelets have a nerve cord running along the back, pharyngeal gill slits, and a tail that runs past the anus. Also like vertebrates, the muscles are arranged in blocks called myomeres. The notochord, unlike the vertebrates, the dorsal nerve cord is not protected by bone, but the simple notochord made up of a cylinder of cells that are closely packed to form a toughened rod. The lancelet notochord, unlike the vertebrate spine, extends into the head, giving them their name. The lancelets also have oral tentacles that hang in front of the mouth and act as sensory devices and as a filter for water passing into the body. The water exits the body via the atriopore. Taking a look at lancelet anatomy, we can see they have oral tentacles that capture food and then bring it into the mouth, and pharyngeal gill slits that trap that food with mucus, and then cilia are what move the food to the intestine. They have an atrium, atriopore, which is not the anus. The atriopore is used to pump water out. The segmental muscles, notice their arrangement around the notochord, using the notochord as a stiffened rod for muscle attachment. And again, we see the tail that's past the anus, dorsal hollow nerve cord, and notochord. On to the subphylum Vertebrata. We will be discussing 7 classes fish through mammals. And we, as humans, are in that group. And we can see that we have a brain, spinal cord, and all of our 4 major characteristics of chordata in development. This group originated about 525 million years ago during the Cambrian explosion, which saw the rise of organism diversity. But the notochord develops into a vertebral column, which protects the spinal cord. And the notochord becomes intervertebral discs, or cartilage discs, in between each vertebrae. We have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, a central nervous system, and the skull increases intelligence, protecting the eyes, ears, and brain. The first known vertebrate is believed to be the Mylocomenia. Unlike other fauna that dominated the Cambrian, early groups had the basic vertebrate body, a notochord, rudimentary vertebrae, and a well-defined head and tail. All of these early vertebrates lacked jaws in the common sense and relied on filter feeding close to the seabed. The skull is thought to have facilitated the development of intelligence as it protects vital organs such as the brain, the eyes, and the ears. The protection of these organs is also thought to have positively influenced the development of high responsiveness to the environment, often found in vertebrates. Other traits that unite all vertebrates are a brain, close circulation, and a heart. Now, we have basically in our primitive heart an atria that receives blood from the body and ventricles that send blood to the body. A two-chambered heart in Agnatha and fishes, and a single circuit of blood flow. Blood is pumped from the ventricle to gills via arteries, and blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. After picking up O2 and expelling CO2, the blood returns to the atrium via veins, and blood vessels carry blood to the heart. There is no segregation of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood in the heart. The three-chambered heart, we see in amphibians, blood returning from the body, and the lungs is mixed in a single ventricle, less efficient than the four-chambered heart. And we see those in birds, in mammals, and crocodilians, are the two streams of blood flow that separate oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Other things are the urinary system with two kidneys, a complete digestive system from mouth to anus, and a cloaca, and that's an exit for digestive and urinary waste, reproductive opening. We don't see the cloaca in mammals. Key innovations, such as jaws, bony skeleton, lungs, limbs, amniotic, egg, were the innovations that led to adaptive radiation of vertebrates, which is a rapid period of diversification. The vertebrae provided support and enclosed the vital spinal cord in adults. Note that it's not the case in sharks, rays, and skates. Those are made out of cartilage, but still have the same essential function as the backbone that we have. The bony skeleton provides support against the force of gravity and for fish withstanding deep sea pressures. And really is a good place for muscle attachment. Jaws, so a separate mandible that allowed some sort of compressional force in the buccal cavity, enabled new feeding opportunities and methods, allowing fish to bite off chunks rather than simple sucking like lampreys. And, of course, lungs. Sac-like organs within the body, which blood flows and exchanges gases with the air. The first lungs evolved in fish, some of which lived part of their lives on land. Some fish still exist that live part of their life on land, such as the mud skipper. And, of course, limbs. Limbed animals have four limbs and thus are called tetrapods. They evolved from a lungfish that had bony-like fins, or fleshy fins. And these limbs were critical to movement on land, where swimming was with paired appendages and tails was not adequate for locomotion. Unless, of course, you're in sand. And the amniotic egg. What the amnion is a wider, tight capsule that enabled offspring to develop on land without the risk of desiccation. And parents could readily protect when their offspring were in the most vulnerable stages of embryonic development. The first such eggs evolved in one tetrapod lineage, from which all reptiles, birds, and mammals arose. And these have been the most diverse or successful tetrapods on land. Let's move on to the classic Agnatha, which are jawless. So, hagfish and lampreys are examples of these. Hagfish are scavengers, and we find them in fresh and salt water. And they feed on detritus, typically at the bottom of a lake or a river. And lampreys can be parasites that will use their round mouths and those teeth-like structures with a very rough radula that burrow a hole into a fish's scales, and they're able to suck blood and eat nutrients from the fish. Invasion of the Great Lakes, so sea lampreys are considered a pest in the Great Lakes region. The species is native to the inland Finger Lakes and Lake Champlain of New York and Vermont, where it migrates to at breeding times from the Atlantic Ocean. So they live a double life of sea and fresh water. It's not clear whether it is native to Lake Ontario, where it was first noticed in the 1830s, or it was introduced through the Erie Canal, which opened in 1825. It is thought that improvements on the Welland Canal in 1919 allowed its spread from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. And while it was never abundant in either lake, it soon spread to Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior, where it decimated indigenous fish populations in the 1930s and 40s. Lampreys have created a problem with their aggressive parasitism on key predator species and game fish, such as lake trout, lake whitefish, chub, lake herring. The lake trout plays a vital role in the Lake Superior ecosystem. The lake trout is considered an apex predator. And with the removal of that apex predator from a system, the entire system is affected. The sea lamprey is an aggressive predator and parasite by nature, which gives it a competitive advantage in a lake system where it has no predators, and its prey lack defenses against it. The sea lamprey played a large role in the destruction of Lake Superior lake trout populations. Lamprey introduction, along with poor, unsustainable fishing practices, caused the lake trout populations to decline drastically. This resulted in a relationship between the predators and prey in the Great Lakes ecosystem become unbalanced. As far as control, including electric current, chemical lampricides and barriers have met with varied success. For example, the purpose of barriers is to block upstream migration of the lampreys to allow for minimal reproduction. The issue with these barriers is that other aquatic species are also inhibited by the barrier. Fish that use tributaries are impeded from traveling upstream to spawn. To account for the issue, barriers have been altered and designed to allow the passage of most fish species, but still impede others. Control programs are carried out by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, a joint Canada-U.S. body, specifically by the agents of the Fisheries and Oceans of Canada and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Further looking at class Agnatha, we can see lampreys and hagfish. Lampreys, there's about 50 species of freshwater jawless fishes that attach to hosts using its oral disc with horny teeth and burrow hole using its radula at the same time secreting enzymes that can break down the scales of fish. The hagfish are commonly known as slime eels because they can rapidly convert water to slime, which they excrete as a defense that suffocates predators by clogging their gills. And there's a cartilaginous endoskeleton that's made of chondrichthyes, but not bone. And then they do have a notochord, again, that's made of chondrichthyes. It's a flexible rod, and it's a primitive backbone where muscles attach, and it protects the dorsal hollow nerve cord. What's interesting about hagfish, as you can see on some videos of them, is a hagfish will tie themselves in a granny knot and slide that knot down their body, along with the mucus they excrete from their body, makes it nearly impossible to hang on to them with your hand, or a predator to hang on to them with their mouth. Let's move on to class Chondrichthyes, which covers the sharks, skates, and rays. How do we tell the difference between skates and rays? If we look at the two bottom pictures, we can see they're both similar in shape. However, skates have a pelvic fin that's divided into two lobes, and their tails are relatively stocky without a stinging spine. And rays, each pelvic fin has one lobe, and their tails are relatively slender to whip-like, usually with a saw-edged stinging spine midway down. However, manta rays would be an example of a ray that is not a stingray. Sharks are essential to oceanic ecosystems, and they can be the apex predators. And of course, from the example before, if an apex predator is removed from a system, then the ecosystem becomes unbalanced. Unfortunately, that picture to the top right shows multiple sharks being fished. Many companies will use their fins for a delicacy in Asia called shark fin soup, and for their meat and their oil. Continuing on with class Chondrichthyes. There are about 850 species in this class, and sharks are the most threatened by overfishing and being caught in fishing nets. They're large marine predators or scavengers. They have the first true jaw, in our phylum. And some of those jaws are some of the most powerful of any known vertebrate. They have a cartilaginous endoskeleton. They have paired appendages, fins, a lateral line system. So those are canals within the skin that are lined with sense receptors, which sense pressure changes in the water flowing through these canals. If you look closely at the skin of these fish, you'll see tiny pores, which are openings to the lateral line canals. They have a heterocircle tail, which means it has curvature to it. They do not possess a swim bladder, which Osteichthyes, the bony fish, have a swim bladder that fills with air or gas and then can be deflated to control buoyancy. Instead, sharks, skates, and rays rely on very large livers that secrete oil. And this oil, of course, is less dense than water, and that is how they control their buoyancy and vertical position in the water column. And they do not possess an operculum, which is a gill cover that bony fish have to protect their gills. Some sharks must swim constantly to get O2 from the water and maintain their vertical position, but other sharks have developed unique ways of pumping water through their mouth. They have gills, and it varies how many slits they have. Some are 7, some are 5. They have denticles. Their scales are shaped like little teeth and are very rough to the touch. And many sharks have internal fertilization and live birth, and some lay eggs. Why are bony fish the most diverse vertebrates, with over 30,000 species? Well, they dominate all fresh and marine ecosystems, and that's because they have a myriad of feeding adaptations. They can be predators, parasites, mutualistic with other sea life, herbivores, and phytoplankton consumers that have little competition for food. Off to the right, we see 3 pictures. In the top right, we see a parrotfish that has a hard mouth with hard teeth-like structures, able to crush coral and eat the live part of coral. We have below that a pufferfish that eats phytoplankton and small plankton organisms. And then below that, in the bottom right, we have a bioluminescent deep-sea anglerfish, which does use a lure that lights up and attracts other small fish or other prey that are attracted to light, and it gobbles them up in those big jaws. Aquatic ecosystems are vast, the most voluminous ecosystems, and offer many niches in which species fill. So we have bottom dwellers, we have coral reefs, they'll be in kelp forests, intertidal zones, and deep sea zones, such as the abyssal plains. We also have a problem with invasive species. As you know, Arizona has the common carp, and that carp has invaded nearly every lake and stream in this state, and now is a threat to the Great Lakes. So take a look at those videos of the Asian carp in the Great Lakes, a mutualism video, and the bioluminescent deep sea anglerfish video. Osteichthyes, as we mentioned, are the most diverse group of vertebrates. Over half of all described vertebrates are bony fish. And they have a few derived traits. A bony skeleton, which muscles attach and for protection. I do not want you students to think that cartilage is any less of a material. Sharks, skates, and rays are capable of locomotion as fast or faster than many Osteichthyes. Bony fish have an operculum. It's a gill covering. It protects the delicate tissues of the gills, and swim bladders that fill with gas and can deflate and inflate, controlling buoyancy going up and down in the water column without much muscle effort. Ancestral traits are jaws, of course, lateral line, and paired fins. We can see the lateral lines there on that very large striped bass. And off to the right, we see a salmon with a slim bladder. And there's a video there on fish ecology. Why is the fishing industry collapsing? What are the implications for aquatic ecosystems and for human economies? Well, one is overfishing. According to a 2008 UN report, The world's fishing fleets are losing $50 billion US dollars each year through depleted stocks and poor fisheries management. The report, produced jointly by the World Bank and the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, or FAO, asserts that half the world's fishing fleet could be scrapped with no change in catch. In addition, the biomass of global fish stocks have been allowed to run down to a point where it is no longer possible to catch the amount of fish that could be caught. Many scientists say most fish populations could be restored with aggressive fisheries management, better enforcement of laws governing catches, and increased use of aquaculture. And in many regions, there is still reason for hope, but illegal fishing and unsustainable harvesting still plague the industry. And a public grown accustomed to abundant seafood and largely apathetic about the plight of the oceans complicates efforts to repair the damage we've done. All right, so let's take a look at the graph off to the left. And we see a graph of overfishing. So we see on our y-axis species depleted in or collapsed in percent, and then the x-axis is time. We see from 1950 to a projected 2050, and we can see a clear trend downward. The problem is ignoring regeneration time needed for fish populations. And so 90% of fish populations are heading to extinction. A big problem are bycatch. 40% of the catch is thrown back dead. And trolling destroys the sea bottom ecosystems, which take 50 years to reestablish, somewhat like a forest. And non-targeted animals are killed, and that includes sea turtles, dolphins, rays, and sharks, and their populations are threatened. So take a look at that video on sustainable fish farming and also the threatening of populations of bycatch. We can see the graph in the middle right is just for cod species. We can see that it has dramatically collapsed in the last part of the graph. And then we can see in the bottom right a picture of a ship equipped with nets for trolling the bottom of the ocean. What is the solution? Sustainable seafood is a movement that has gained momentum, and more people are becoming aware of overfishing and environmentally destructive fishing methods. Sustainable seafood is seafood from either fished or farmed sources that can maintain or increase production in the future without jeopardizing the ecosystems from which it was acquired. In general, slow-growing fish that reproduce late in life, such as orange roughies, are vulnerable to overfishing. Seafood species that grow quickly and breed young, such as anchovies and sardines, are much more resistant to overfishing. Several organizations, including the Marine Stewardship Council, MSC, and the Friend of the Sea, certified seafood fisheries are as sustainable. The Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch program, although not officially certifying body like the MSC, also provides guidance on the sustainability of certain fish species. Some seafood restaurants have begun to offer more sustainable seafood options. Another group, called the Seafood Choices Alliance, is an organization whose members include chefs that serve sustainable seafood at their establishments. Daniel Pauly, a fisheries scientist well known for his pioneering work on the human impacts of global fisheries, comments, "It is almost as though we use our military to fight the animals in the oceans. We are gradually winning this war to exterminate them. And to see this destruction happen, for nothing really, for no reason, that is a bit frustrating. Strangely enough, these effects are all reversible, and the animals that would have disappeared would reappear, and the animals that were small would grow. The relationships that you can't see anymore would reestablish themselves, and the system would reemerge. So that's one thing to be optimistic about. The oceans, much more so than land, are reversible." Another problem are invasive species, such as the grass carp, black carp, bighead carp, and silver carp. Pose a threat to other species, native species, of other fish and invertebrates. How did the first animal, which was a fish, move onto land? Let's take a look at our pictures. Off to the right, we have a mud skipper, which is a fish. that has lungs and walks on land. You can see a video there. We have a lungfish below that, which again has lungs and has appendages for walking on land, and there's a video of that. And then there's the Ichthyostega, which is a fossilized fish-like amphibian that came out onto land. Lobed fin fishes were the first tetrapods to emerge onto land because they had bones in their fins, whereas rayed fin fishes do not have bones. They evolved into the ancestors of amphibians at the end of the Devonian period, which was 360 million years ago. All right, so why might natural selection have led to the evolution of terrestrial tetrapods? Insects had already become terrestrial. There was a food source. So fishes that could explore land could seek out food and avoid aquatic predators. And also habitats that dried out seasonally would favor fishes that had some mutation enabling survival during these dry periods. As we know, in Arizona, there are many lakes that are ephemeral and only appear in the spring and then dry up by the end of the summer. Ichthyostega possessed lungs and limbs that helped it navigate through shallow water in swamps. Though undoubtedly of amphibian build and habit, it is not considered to be a true member of the group in the narrow sense, as was first true amphibians appeared in the Carboniferous period. On to class Amphibia, which are frogs, salamanders, toads, and caecilians. Not a person from Sicily, as you can see the spelling is different. Salamanders and newts are probably the most ancestral group of amphibians, resembling the early tetrapods. There are only about 500 species of salamanders and newts, while frogs and toads comprise the bulk of radiation, with the largest lineage over 5,000 species. Salamanders and newts, the larvae have gills, but otherwise resemble adults. Caecilians look like worms, but are actually amphibians that inhabit the wet tropical regions of South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia in rainforests. They make up one of 3 orders of amphibians, alongside frogs and salamanders. They lack limbs, but possess a retractable sensory tentacle. Caecilians, with the exception of a few aquatic species, have a burrowing lifestyle into fossorial habitats. The skin of one African species is fat and nutrient-rich, so larvae peel the skin off the parent and eat it. That's a new job for parenthood. Here, eat my skin. Amphibians are ectothermic, so their temperature should be close to matching the outside temperature wherever they are. Their life cycle, as we know from our childhood experiences, females will lay eggs in water, and in frogs and toads, they'll have males secreting sperm over the eggs and external fertilization. However, many amphibians have internal fertilization as well. They have aquatic larvae, and we call those in frogs and toads tadpoles, but in salamanders and caecilians we do not call them tadpoles, call them larvae. And tadpoles have a mouth, and they feed. They can be predators, they can be herbivores, and then they metamorphose into the adults. And adults are carnivores and typically insectivores. They breathe with permeable skin, so the skin is highly vascular. And frogs, caecilians, and salamanders have mucus-covered skin, which is very susceptible for intaking pollutants. But there are many frogs that secrete through their skin a toxin, such as the poison dart frog at the top picture there. We see below that a marine toad, and off to the right an egg mass of an anuran. And below that in the bottom picture is the caecilian. Since they live a fossorial lifestyle, they have reduced eyes. And typically in the amphibian world, if you see a brightly colored species, they can be poisonous or noxious to predators or be mimicking one of those species. What threatens amphibians globally? 10% of amphibians are endangered and over 50% of them are threatened. Why is this? Well, As I mentioned, amphibians respire through their skin, and the majority of their respiration is through their skin. In fact, the bottom right picture of the blue-spotted salamander, that species does not have lungs at all and relies completely on dermal respiration. So you can imagine with respiring skin, it's only going to be a few cell layers thick to allow for fairly rapid gas exchange. But this also means that when pollutants come into contact with the skin, they are easily absorbed into the capillaries below and make the animal sick, often killing it. The only species of salamander in Arizona is the tiger salamander, which is in the bottom middle picture. And then a unique species is the bottom left picture, the oxalotl, which is a Mexican salamander. And interestingly, they retain their juvenile characteristics of gills, those are those feathery things around its head, but are able to reproduce as a larval form, a condition known as neoteny. In the top right, we have a caecilian, again, and they have the same problem as frogs, toads, and salamanders. They respire through their skin, so very susceptible to pollutants. And then in the top middle, we have an Australian green tree frog. One of the largest tree frogs has a unique ability of secreting a waxy substance around their body. And then in the top left, we can see the Chinese giant salamander, one of two groups of giant salamanders. There's also a Japanese giant salamander, which they live in large rivers and they fish. Another interesting reason why amphibians are on the decline is a fungus called the chytrid fungus. And this comes from, originally, a poison dart frog in Central America that has become invasive and has spread on the backs of invasive amphibians, one being the bullfrog of North America, Ranicates biana, that carries chytrid fungus from pond to pond. Moving away now from the amphibians and into the amniotes, how did they become more adapted to dry land? And this includes the reptiles, crocodilians, birds, and mammals. This happened about 135 million years ago in the early Carboniferous period. A lineage of vertebrates branched from the amphibians and evolved many adaptations that enabled the life cycle of the resulting group, which are reptiles, to become completely independent of water. Remember that amphibians have to return to water to breed. How are the 5 traits of all amniotes adaptive to life in habitats away from water? Well, the watertight eggs allow for embryos to develop out of water. Internal fertilization eliminates the necessity of water for sperm to swim to the eggs, such as in frogs and toads, and allow the eggs to be carried and thus protected by the female. And sex is internal and is much more direct than amphibians. How does the amniotic egg provide an adaptive advantage to life on land? Embryos can now develop outside of water because the amniotic egg is watertight. Embryos won't dry out, however, they still allow gas exchange. Embryos are protected from bacterial and fungal infection and small predators inside a hard shell, and because it is round, is very hard to crack in certain applications of force. Different regions within the egg compartmentalize waste, nutrients, air, and the embryo itself. Looking at that egg diagram, how do you think the amniotic egg provides shock absorption? Take a look at the albumin. It surrounds the entire embryo and the yolk in a gelatinous pad. And if we see the chorion is for gas exchange, which is easily going through the shell. And then, of course, we have lots of amniotic fluid on the inside to keep the little embryo encased in fluid. Again, the more adapted dry land traits are watertight eggs, internal fertilization, eyelids to protect the desiccation from eyes, keratin-rich skin to be able to waterproof the skin, and an efficient pair of kidneys. Looking at class Reptilia, which cover snakes, turtle, lizards, crocodilians, and the dinosaurs, you see that they're the first class independent from water for their whole life cycle. We can see their pictures here, off to the right. In the top left picture is our own gopher snake from Arizona. The top right, we have a Jackson's chameleon, and on its horns we have a dwarf chameleon. The bottom left we have a sea turtle, and the bottom right we have a green anole from Georgia and the Carolinas. Their internal fertilization means that the male and female must put their cloaca together and directly put the male gametes into the female. They have a watertight amniotic egg, which we know. They do have eyelids, except for snakes. Snakes have a covering over their eyes, which is a clear scale, kind of like goggles. They have watertight skin and very protective, hard scales. They're ectothermic, which again, like the amphibians, the body temperature is the environmental temperature. However, as with amphibians and reptiles, they display a high degree of thermoregulation via behavior, so they can use a cool spot and a hot spot to keep their temperature in between someplace. And, of course, they communicate, as amphibians do. That anole at the bottom right is using his dewlap to show off his dominance. Chameleons in the top right, there's a video called Rainbow Defense you should take a look at. And then snakes display some color change, but for the most part that is a lizard phenomena. And of course those color change and behaviors with communication can also be used for mating displays. The degree of parental care seen in amphibians and reptiles typically is low. However, with crocodilians, it is known that the females will make a mound and then wait for the eggs to hatch, and the little babies will crawl out of the mound and they will sit near her or in her mouth sometimes, and she will monitor them until they're of an age where they're not as vulnerable. What threatens reptiles globally? Well, of course, habitat loss. So, what is a wetland? A wetland is an area of land, as you might have guessed, that has water in it, and the water table is fairly high, however, not like a lake, where plants can grow in it. The United States has lost over half of the wetlands in the lower 48 states, and the losses continued at an estimate of over 60,000 acres per year. The life-supporting importance of wetlands was largely unrecognized in the past. People drained, dredged, dammed, and channeled wetlands, eliminating or converting them into dry land or filling them for lakes and water retention areas. Changing the wetlands into croplands, pasture, and subdivisions, mining for underlying resources, ridding of insect life, filling them for roadbeds or flooding them for open water lakes, and using them for dumping grounds for waste and sewage are all reasons why reptiles that live in and around wetlands would be becoming more extirpated, which means extinct for that area. ORV, off-road vehicles, in that bottom left picture, you can see a portion of the Colorado Plateau that is being disturbed or destroyed by these ORVs. Overharvesting. There are some states that have what's called a rattlesnake roundup, where they'll go out and collect as many of these rattlesnakes as possible. One of the activities that is enjoyed during these rattlesnake roundups, which is a big public event, is to take the snake, turn it upside down, slit its throat, drain the blood into a pan, and children will come over and dip their hands into the snake blood and put their little handprints on big white pieces of paper to show their parents. Gator roundups are becoming more common in Florida and other states with the American alligator because people are moving into their habitat and there's more interaction between humans and American alligators. But they're no longer endangered. They're doing quite well. But the American crocodile on the top left is endangered, and you'll find those in marshes and swamps. And also what is threatening native reptiles are non-native reptiles, such as in the bottom right picture. of a Burmese python that has invaded now the wetlands of the Everglades in Florida in Dade County. And this is now an apex predator and challenges the other reptiles for their position. Some notable reptiles in the crocodilian world. We know that most ancient living species and the only living ancestors to birds are alligators, crocodiles, gavials, and caimans. The largest lizard is a Komodo dragon, not to be confused with crocodilians. Crocodilians have a 4-chambered heart, whereas lizards have a 3-chambered heart. It's found on a few islands around Komodo Island and is a scavenger. Here in the U.S., in the lower 48, we have 30 species of rattlesnakes, and most are here in Arizona. And the most notable being the western diamondback, which is one of the most lethal snakes because of its length being over 6 feet long and its strike range being a few feet. An interesting note, the most bitten individuals in this state and California are males that are 19 years old and have been intoxicated. My advice, if you see a rattlesnake while you're out camping and you're intoxicated, please leave it alone. That's why the rattle sounds the way it does. The largest tortoise is the Galapagos tortoise, found on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. And marine iguanas in the bottom middle picture. They are herbivores and eat various seaweeds in the intertidal region of the Galapagos Islands. And the smallest reptile is a little tiny chameleon called the dwarf chameleon, and it's of the genus Brachysia. Most other chameleons are in the genus Cameleo. How did birds evolve, leaving the reptile group and going into aves? Birds arose from a single lineage of reptiles and are technically classified as reptiles by some, if not most, modern scientists. Paleontologists regard birds as the only clade of dinosaurs to survive the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction event 65.5 million ago, and it is presumed that a meteorite struck the Earth near Chicxulub, Mexico. Taking a look now at feathered dinosaurs, like the Sinosauropteryx. This dinosaur had feathers, yes, but clearly he did not fly. The feathers presumably provided warmth, so that this cold-blooded, ectothermic dinosaur could remain active at cooler temperatures. The fossil of this animal was found in China, from which it was named Sinosauropteryx, the first Chinese feathered dragon. Archaeopteryx, the size of a large crow, was discovered in 1861, just 2 years after Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. Archaeopteryx seemed to confirm Darwin's theories, since become a key piece in the evidence for origin of birds, transitional fossils debate, and the confirmation of evolution. Indeed, further research on dinosaurs from the Gobi Desert and China has since provided more evidence of a link between Archaeopteryx and the dinosaurs, such as the Chinese feathered dragon. Archaeopteryx is close to the ancestry of modern birds, and it shows most of the features one would expect in an ancestral bird. However, it may not be the direct ancestor of living birds, and it is uncertain how much evolutionary divergence was already present among other birds at the time. Did he fly? It's unclear whether Archaeopteryx was a simple glider or capable of flapping flight. The lack of a bony breastbone suggests it was not a strong flyer. Confuciusornis santus, the earliest known, quote, bird with a beak. Note that this bird-like dinosaur, or is it a dinosaur-like bird, depicts the transition between dinosaurs and birds very well. This species had wings, but still fingers and claws. It likely flew as well. And what's the closest living relatives to birds? Crocodiles and alligators. Crocodiles and alligators having a 4-chambered heart along with birds. Moving on to the class Aves, or birds. There's over 8,000 species described globally, 900 species in North America. Hollow bones is one of the traits that birds have. They have air cavities inside of those bones, which make them lightweight. For example, an adult bald eagle with a wingspan over 5.5 feet weighs less than 14 pounds. They exhibit a great deal of parental care. Eggs are ectothermic, so they need a parent to provide warmth while the embryos develop. And parents also feed hatchlings until they can fly. They have complex social behaviors. So we know the peacock exhibits a very complex behavior to attract a mate. And they have increased intelligence. As we know, many parrots, like the African gray parrot, show a great deal of problem solving. There are 3 videos there. They've got 2 videos on intelligence of birds and then a video on gray parrots. Be sure to look at those. And then we have 3 videos on the social behaviors of birds. The diagram to the bottom right is about the finches of the Galapagos Islands. There are now at least 13 species of finches on the Galapagos Islands, each filling a different niche on different islands, and thereby reducing competition for food among species. All of them evolved from one ancestral species, which colonized the islands only a few million years ago. This process, whereby species evolve rapidly to exploit empty ecospace, is known as adaptive radiation. The ecological niches exert the natural selection pressures that push the populations in various directions. On various islands, finch species have become more adapted for different diets, seeds, insects, flowers, and blood of seabirds and leaves. And on that, the evolution along with their diet, they have various different beak shapes and functions. We can see a warbler finch has a long tweezer-like bill to be able to poke into holes inside of a tree and pull insects out. We have the woodpecker finch. It's able to drill a hole or make a hole into bark and also use a tool to poke into beetle grubs. We have a small insectivorous tree finch, again, a bill that's designed for catching insects and trees. And then we have a vegetarian tree finch that eats seeds and fruits. An interesting question in the evolution of birds is, how did flight evolve? Well, of course, the forelimbs and their morphology evolved into wings. So what are the major adaptations in birds that enable them to fly? What do you suppose were present in the winged dinosaurs like Archaeopteryx? Feathers are modified scales and reflect the evolutionary origin of birds from reptiles. Now we're talking they have endothermy, which they can maintain a body temperature, which means they use energy to regulate their body temperature. Notably, birds are the only extant living animals with feathers. The structure of feathers have branch structure consisting of a main shaft from which barbs pinnately branch, like a leaf, from which barbules pinnately branch, from where hooks branch. When birds preen, they are reconnecting the hooks to nearby barbules to return the integrity to the feather. So the feather hooks into the feather adjacent to it, making a superstructure of feathers. Forelimbs are modified into wings. And what happened to the palm of the forelimb and what happened to the fingers? Well, we can see in our diagram there is a palm and there are fingers still, but they have shifted, instead of using for grasping, now to modulate the shape of the wing to accommodate for different currents of air, thus flight. Of course, we have many birds here in Arizona. In the top left, we have our green heron. In the left top middle, we have a oyster catcher, which eats specifically oysters. The bird next to it, in the top middle right, is an evening grosbeak, which eats many big seeds. In the top right, we have an eared owl, It's related to the great horned owl. In the middle left, we have a picture of many different birds, sandhill cranes, and some geese and gulls. And the one next to it, the black one we're familiar with, which is a raven. And then the one next to that one to the right is the common tern, and the middle right is a vermilion flycatcher being banded to track their whereabouts. The bottom left is a green jay found in the southeast of the state. And then the bottom middle are pictures of some ground eggs, such as quail, or Gambel's quail. And the bottom right is a zone-tailed hawk. What are the threats to birds? Habitat loss, such as loss of wetlands, destroy migratory stops. Overhunting. Many people enjoy hunting certain ducks for eating. Of course, introduction of exotic invasive species such as cats, which technically come from the Saharan desert. They're known to eat quite a few birds per day. And of course, things like Burmese pythons down in Florida will eat ground birds. Wind turbines do pose a threat, but a study estimates that wind farms are responsible for 0.3 to 0.4 fatalities of birds per gigawatt hour of electricity, while fossil-fueled power stations are responsible for about 5.2 fatalities per gigawatt hour. So between the two of them, wind farming is much better for birds. Structures that can cause confusion in flight. As we know, birds will fly into windows, and that occurs in skyscrapers as well as homes. Of course, oil rigs, as demonstrated in the Gulf oil spill a few years ago, can coat birds' feathers in oil, thus rendering them so they cannot fly. And other things like artificial lights can mess the navigation of birds up as they migrate. And of course, the story of DDT is a pollutant. First synthesized in 1874, DDT's insecticidal properties were not discovered until 1939, and it was used with great success in the second half of the World War II to control malaria and typhus among civilians and troops. The Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1948 for his discovery of the high efficiency of DDT as a contact poison against several arthropods. After the war, DDT was made available for use as an agricultural insecticide, and soon its production and use skyrocketed. In 1962, Silent Spring by American biologist Rachel Carson was published. The book cataloged the environmental impacts of the indiscriminate spraying of DDT in the U.S., questioned the logic of releasing large amounts of chemicals into the environment without fully understanding their effects on the ecology and human health. The book suggested that DDT and other pesticides may cause cancer, and that their agricultural use was a threat to wildlife, particularly birds. Its publication was one of the signature events in the birth of the environmental movement, and resulted in a large public outcry that eventually led to the DDT being banned in the U.S. in 1972. DDT was subsequently banned for agricultural use worldwide under the Stockholm Convention, but its limited use in disease vector control continues to this day and remains controversial. Along with the passage of the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. ban on DDT is cited by scientists as a major factor in the comeback of the bald eagle, the U.S. national bird, from near extinction in the contiguous U.S. Now on to mammals. How did mammals evolve? The first mammals appeared in the late Triassic, around 200 million years ago. However, a discovery of a partial skeleton of a small shrew-like mammal described online in Nature in August 2011 pushes back the date of the divergence by 30 million years to 230 million years ago. Found in the famous fossil beds of Liaoning, China, the newly discovered little mammal has been named Juramamia sinensis, or Jurassic Mother from China. It's not certain where and when true placental mammals evolved. The earliest undisputed fossil of placentals come from the early Paleocene, after the extinction of the dinosaurs. The mammal-like animals expanded out of their nocturnal insectivore niche from the mid-Jurassic onwards. For example, Castrocata has adaptations for swimming, digging, and catching fish. rise to the dominance in the Cenozoic. Mammals took over the medium to large-sized ecological roles in the Cenozoic after the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction event that emptied ecological space once filled by reptiles. Then mammals diversified very quickly. Both birds and mammals show an exponential rise in diversity. An example is the earliest known bat dates from about 50 million years ago to only 15 million years after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So taking a look at some of the pictures there, we have a reptile-like amniote, a reptile-like amniote with some hair, a fur-covered mammal ancestor, and then the earliest known mammal. Now on to the diversity of mammals. Although morphologically diverse, from whales to beavers to giraffes, lions, manatees, tarsiers, giant anteaters, and three-toed sloths, the smallest vertebrate class, with only 4,000 species that have been described. However, occasionally in a rainforest, 1 or 2 species every decade will be discovered. Like birds, we are endothermic. We're the only animals to have fur or hair, and those are modifications of scales across the evolution of mammals from lizard-like ancestor. Hair enables these animals to use less energy to maintain their core body temperature, critical in cold habitats. However, some of these mammals wear clothes, such as humans and dogs, for that reason. Mammals are also the only animals to produce fatty tissue, adipose tissue, which helps maintain their core body temperatures. We use mammary glands that produce milk, hence our name, to nourish young. And we're the only animals to have sweat glands. Although mammals have a 4-chambered heart, their circulatory systems are nowhere near as efficient as that of birds. The dentition, which birds lack teeth, mammals evolved several different types of teeth, specializing each group of mammals for a different diet. We have larger brains. We have a neocortex, a brain region that is unique to mammals. Placental mammals have a corpus callosum, unlike monotremes and marsupials. It's a structure in the brain that connects left and right halves. The size and number of cortical areas, or Brodmann's areas, is at least in monotremes about 8 to 10, and most in placentals up to 50. The 6-layer neocortex has been found in the brains of all mammals, but not in any other animals. In birds, there are clear examples of cognitive processes that are thought to be neocortical in nature, despite the lack of a distinctive 6-layer neocortical structure. In a similar manner, reptiles and turtles have primary sensory cortices. A consistent alternative name has yet to be agreed upon. In intelligent mammals, such as primates, the cerebrum is relatively large to the rest of the brain. Intelligence itself is not easy to define, but indications of intelligence include the ability to learn, matched with behavioral flexibility and problem solving. Be sure to check out many of the videos we have here on sedations, which are large oceanic mammals, such there as the orca. We've got one on the manatee, little primate called the tarsier, and also on the 3-toed sloth, and then also about intelligence of the mammalian brain. What are the lineages of mammals? Well, there are 3 groups. There are monotremes, such as the spiny echidna and the platypus. They lay eggs and outhatch a mammal. They lack nipples, but they have milk glands on their belly. There are marsupials that have very short gestation, and like kangaroos, and so they'll have live birth of a fetus, which we call a joey, in a kangaroo, and it's very small, and it's in the pouch, and feeds on a nipple within the pouch as the joey matures. And then placental mammals, we have longer gestation, which is more than a month, and in some cases can be up to almost 2 years. And we nourish the young in the placenta with the mother's blood, and then with milk glands after they're born. Be sure to check out the Kangaroo Joey video. It's quite a cute film. What threatens mammals globally? Well, in the wildlife trade, hunting for the illegal wildlife trade has the greatest potential to do maximum harm in minimal time and has a serious threat to a number of endangered and vulnerable species. Illegal wildlife trade and contraband include live pets, hunting trophies, fashion accessories, cultural artifacts, ingredients for traditional medicines, and wild meat for human consumption. Bushmeat trade was considered illegal when imports occur in contravention of the Washington Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora, CITES, national quarantine laws, and other laws that ban the trade of specific animals. Illegal wildlife trade is broadly defined as an environmental crime which directly harms the environment. Wildlife trafficking is driven by organized groups who exploit natural resources, endangered threatened species, and ecosystems in contravention of CITES. Environmental crimes, by their very nature, are transboundary, using porous boundaries, and involve cross-border criminal syndicates, characterized by irregular migration, money laundering, corruption, and the exploitation of disadvantaged communities. The links between wealth, poverty, and engagement in the wildlife trade are complex. People involved in the trade are not necessarily poor, and the poor who are involved do not capture the majority of the trade's monetary value. In 2002, the illegal wildlife trade was estimated to be the second largest illegal trade, second only to the drugs trade, with a value of at least 10 billion pounds in English pounds. In 2008, it was estimated that it's worth at least US $5 billion and may potentially total excess of $20 billion annually. This ranks the illegal wildlife trade as among the most lucrative illicit economies in the world, behind illegal drugs and possibly human trafficking and arms trafficking. Due to its clandestine nature, the illegal trade was difficult to quantify with any accuracy. Potential areas of market growth include the internet, where traders use chat rooms and auction websites to engage in illicit wildlife sales. Poaching is another threat. There have been many national and international actions taken against certain kinds of poaching. Hunting for ivory was banned in 1989, but the poaching of elephant continues in many parts of Africa stricken by economic decline. The Philippines has more than 400 endangered animals, all of which are illegal to poach. The bushmeat trade initially referred to the hunting of wild animals in the West and Central Africa. A more worldwide term is game. The term bushmeat crisis tends to be used to describe unsustainable hunting of often endangered wildlife in the West and Central Africa and the humid tropics, depending on interpretation. African hunting predates recorded history. By the 21st century, it had become an international issue. Many conservation organizations have come together to address bushmeat crisis, though the formation of Bushmeat Crisis Task Force, whose mission is to build public, professional, and government constituency aimed at identifying and supporting solutions that effectively respond to bushmeat crisis in Africa and around the world. Logging concessions have operated by European and Malaysian companies in African forests have closely linked to the bushmeat trade because they provide roads, trucks, and other access to remote forests. They are primary means for the transportation of hunters and meat between forests and urban centers. And of course, climate change. A gradual increase in the warmth of the region will lead to earlier flowering and fruiting times, driving a change in the timing of life cycles of dependent organisms. Conversely, cold will cause plant biocycles to lag. Larger or faster, more radical changes, however, may result in vegetation stress, rapid plant loss, and desertification in certain circumstances. An example of this occurred during the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, an extinction event 300 million years ago. At the time, the vast rainforests covered the equatorial region of Europe and America. Climate change devastated the tropical rainforest, abruptly fragmenting the habitat into isolated islands and causing the extinction of many plant and animal species. Satellite data is available in recent decades and indicates that global terrestrial net primary production increased 6% from 1982 to 1999, with the largest portion of that increase in tropical ecosystems, then decreased by 1% from 2000 to 2009. There's a couple of more videos there on the pet trade and climate change if you're interested. Last words, valuing the diversity of life. The last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, what good is it? If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota, in the course of eons, has built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard the seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. Alda Leopold. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your semester. Good luck on your test.
Hope you'd find a reason, hope you'd find a way, pick a path and season, it doesn't have to be a simple